Now I would like to introduce our speaker, Revathi Subramanian. She is Senior Vice President of Data Science at CA Technologies. Revathi has nearly 2 decades experience in setting up world-class teams to deliver high-end analytical solutions and has built some of the industry's leading fraud and risk management solutions for financial institutions. Some of you may also be familiar with her book that was published last year called Bank Fraud: Using Technology to Combat Losses. We are very excited to have her here with us today to present. And at this point, I will turn it over to Revathi to begin.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for that introduction. Again, I would like to thank TSIS for this wonderful opportunity and also all the listeners for making the time to listen to this. What I'm going to be talking about today is some exciting possibilities that exist, because of the way we collect data, for e-commerce and how that can help us not only to combat e-commerce fraud more effectively, given that U.S. is going the chip and pin route, but also just help us overall with the fraud picture. And I'm going to share with you a specific study that we did on 9 different banks. I think this is something that this audience would find very interesting. So let's get started, talking about the e-commerce, fraud landscape. Again, we all know that e-commerce sales has been booming. It's from $1.25 trillion in 2013 to $2.35 trillion in 2017, which is what is, expected. And we also, expect a billion consumers with smartphones. And growth in e-commerce, unfortunately also means growth in, e-commerce fraud loss. And again, fraud losses have been, going up, significantly. And if you look at mechanisms such as 3D Secure, they certainly provide a way for issuers to have additional information on the transactions, in terms of where the transactions are happening and how it is connecting to the internet and so on, which could really prove to be a gold mine of information, not only in dealing with 3D Secure fraud, just straight, e-commerce 3D Secure fraud, but even in, other areas. So, having said that, if you can move to the next slide, Ashley. Let's look at, I think the one before, you probably skipped one, yeah. If we look at sort of what we do, within risk analytics, in CA, we see over 200 purchase location countries every single day. And that is out of a possible total of 249. So it's really mind-boggling, right? I mean, you get information from across the globe in terms of how fraudsters and real consumers are connecting to the internet and conducting transactions. Every single day, you're able to see, so many countries worth of data. And so, given that I'm a data scientist, we started looking at, is there a way to exploit this in real time? Is there value to understanding that a particular device has been used for transaction by bank B on card 1, followed by, bank A on card 2 for them? And is there a, is the same device being used, and what kind of synergies do we see? Is there a better delineation between fraud and non-fraud we can provide, by having that information? So again, just to emphasize, there are only a total of 249 countries, across the globe, based on this particular standard, which is the ISO 31661 standard, and we are able to see even close to 220 countries or so on any given day. So let's go to the next slide. So the really amazing thing about e-commerce fraud as opposed to general fraud is that we are truly not in Kansas anymore, right? So a card could be something that was issued by an issuer in the U.S., but the actual fraudster could be sitting in a country that's totally different from U.S., somewhere in Eastern Europe, and trying to conduct a transaction on that through a device, that we have never seen before. Now, if you look at it just in terms of what you see on the authorization side, you really have none of that information available, right? It just looks at, it looks like a transaction on xyz.com for a certain amount, and the amount seems very normal, you know, for the particular cardholder and for the time of day, whatever. So if you don't have the location information, there's really a lot of information that's completely lost in terms of, you know, deciding whether something is fraud or not. If you look at how e-commerce fraudsters operate, they absolutely operate from their own backyard. In fact, I would say that, you know, there are probably just a couple of hundred key locations, you know, from where most of these, you know, really serious, you know, crime rings operate. And issuers from across the globe acting as one family to combat these globalized fraud trends certainly has a significant value. So if you see this sort of geographic heat map I have there, you see that the various, you know, shades of sort of coral to deep red to maroon, you know, kind of shades that you have there. The scale itself is it's kind of, you know, logarithmic. You know, you see that every shading, every increase in the color or in the deepness of the color actually could mean, you know, twice as much or sometimes more. You see that in some regions, there could be as much as 10% of all the transactions going through in that region could be fraud. That is really mind-boggling. And it's not only mind-boggling, but it's a goldmine of information from a fraud model perspective that is simply not available, you know, if you're just looking at, you know, authorization data streams, because the IP address and the device, the location of it, how it's connecting to the internet is simply not available, right? Whereas if you have a program for 3D Secure, it is possible not only to have this information, but to utilize it, you know, in real time as well. So let's go to the next slide. So here, you know, we are looking at just transactions in general happening across the globe. So the interesting thing about, you know, e-commerce is that, you know, unlike card-present transactions where you can precisely know what the location of the cardholder is, in e-commerce, you can know the location only if you have this information in terms of, you know, how the device is connecting to the internet and so on. And what we have here is normal transactions happening across the globe that are foreign to every location. So, I mean, if you look at our solution, it actually receives transactions from, you know, from issuers across the globe. So what we've done in this particular sort of heat map we have is if it's a U.S. issuer, we look at transactions that have happened outside the U.S. If it's a U.K. issuer, outside the U.K. and so on. So only look at foreign transactions and only look at those that did not turn out to be fraud. You can see that it pretty much covers the entire globe. So having the additional information as to how the transaction is being conducted by way of, you know, the device configuration as well as location is truly a goldmine of information in not only understanding fraud, but also understanding what is normal, you know, for this cardholder, right? If you don't have that information, you're really missing a big part of the behavior. So let's go to the next one, Ashley. So if you look at the value of 3D Secure, from a cardholder perspective, it makes online shopping safer, right? Safer in the sense that you don't have to be intervened, you know, often, because there are interesting models running behind the scenes that are, you know, that are actually gathering all this information, trying to decide if this is really Ashley performing this transaction or not, right? It makes the online shopping safer while making their shopping experience better. And if you look at it from a, you know, merchant perspective, you know, it shifts the liability to the issuer, you know, for giving them the ability to collect all this information. You know, the merchants basically shift the liability to the issuer. And for issuers, the real value is that it provides tremendous customer insight. And I would say that the goldmine of information that's being collected, you know, as we do a 3D Secure has not been fully exploited yet. And you know, what I'm going to show you by way of study today is actually giving you an idea of how it can be exploited. So let's go to the next one, Ashley. So why do we need models? So what we do is we take this data and we do some very, high-end machine learning to gather features or trends, from the data, in real time. And we also run it through some high-end models like neural network model suites. So why do we need even models? Right? Why can't we just write rules? Well, it is because it provides the ideal combination of predictive power, stability, and flexibility for e-commerce. So it utilizes, state-of-the-art analytic techniques, uncovers behavioral insights on multiple pivots. So what we mean by pivots is, you can understand what the cardholder is doing, what the device is doing. So what the cardholder is doing may be completely in character, but what the device is doing, just doesn't make sense. We have seen the same device being utilized on 7 or 8 different cards, within the last hour, and it's just not characteristic of what we see for normal cards, right? So we can uncover all those behavioral insights. And interestingly, it can reduce fraud and customer friction simultaneously. So a model can take most of the fraud and basically stuff it in the top scoring 2 or 3%. So that is the only portion of the transactions that you really need to actively monitor and do anything with. The rest of them can be allowed without any sort of intervention for authentication. That's the other beauty of models. And provide unparalleled flexibility to the fraud manager. You don't have to make up your mind on how you want to treat what portion of your transactions, you want to deny or authenticate on any given day. Depending on the constraints in operations, you can change your mind, on sort of a daily basis. And those are the benefits that models give you, when you use that in combination, with a really good, 3D secure solution. So this is sort of a given. So what we did was, we said, if we are able to model device ID in real time, what kind of value, can be provided is what we looked at. So let's go to the next slide. So some specifics on the study. So in this particular study, we looked at trends in Europe and Asia Pacific. You might ask why, because these are more mature regions in terms of 3D secure. And I think this could be a good indicator of what is to come, for the U.S. As we go the chip route, and there is more and more, fraud that shifts to online, and more merchants, get onto 3D secure. What are we likely to see? So in this particular study, we took data from 9 different issuers with transactions from late 2013. There were 50.3 million transactions, 10.5 million cards, and 17.1 million devices in total. It was for a short period of time, from late 2013, about 3 to 4 months worth of data. And the average transactional fraud rate for these different issuers was 13. And you will see a couple of slides down that the transactional fraud rate actually varies quite a bit across these issuers. So it gives you kind of a wide spectrum of kind of fraud patterns, so that you can get an idea of how useful it is, whether your fraud loss are really low or kind of high, in the e-commerce space. In both cases, there is considerable value to be had. And we modeled devices and users simultaneously. So what we mean by that is, we looked at what is normal for this cardholder and abnormal, and we are looking at this transaction in the context of everything we know about this cardholder, information that we have gathered intelligently, and we are storing and retrieving in real time to create these features and run it through the neural network model suite. And then in addition, we're also doing the same thing with devices. So if this particular device, has been used at 4 different issuers for 8 different cards, that knowledge exists when we are trying to score this next transaction in real time. So typically, if you look at 3D secure models, they tend to look at one issuer, worth of information. And this was a study where we looked across, multiple issuers, trying to see over and above the best-in-class model we have for e-commerce, what kind of value, we can provide. And the very interesting thing that kind of stared at us, immediately as we started looking at the data was that 13% of all transactions are on devices with transactions from other cards. So it's really a minority, right? So if you look at devices, right, and you see that, whether if you classify transactions as happening from just one device or you on the same device you're seeing transactions from other cards, only 13% of the transactions were on devices with transactions from other cards. So it's a relatively small number. However, if you look at fraud, 49% of all fraud transactions are on devices with fraud transactions from other cards. So right there, you have a feature that could actually distinguish fraud and non-fraud very nicely. Again, when we are building models for fraud, what we're really trying to do is trying to gather those inputs that are going to give us features that distinguish between fraud and non-fraud, right? And you input them in a nonlinear way into a high-end model, and that's how you end up with, a model that performs wonders, right? That really does a very good job of separating out fraud from non-fraud. And you see that, looking at devices where, other cards have also transacted, immediately provided a significant improvement in terms of whether we can identify fraud or not. So there's a big difference in the behavior there. So let's go to the next one. Here again, some interesting stats for you. So if you look at the percent of fraud, right? If you look at the overall fraud, and then you split it into two groups, you say, okay, was there just a single card on that device, or there were multiple cards on the device, right? It splits almost right in the middle. So you see that about 50% of the fraud happens on a single card on device, and about 50%, a little bit more than 50% happens on multiple cards on device. And if you look at foreign transactions, about 33% of the foreign transactions exist in the single card on device group, and if you look at the multiple cards on device group, there's about 29% of them are foreign. Now, if you were to look at just the cardholder information, right, and not utilize the benefit of knowing where all these devices traversed, right, it's certainly losing out on a significant portion of the information on about 50% of the fraud. So on those, could we actually make the performance significantly better by modeling card users as well as devices simultaneously? What's the study that we conducted? Let's go to the next one. Again, some interesting data. I'll share some interesting statistics on the study, and then I'll actually get to what kind of improvement we were able to provide as well. So here, what we have done is, we are looking at frauds with multiple cards on the same device. So on the x-axis, you have the number of cards. On the y-axis, you have the percent of frauds. So very clearly, if you look at the 1 mark, or right next to 0, you see that about 50% is happening there's just a single card on that device, and that's where you see the fraud, right? But if you look at the rest of it, the remaining 50% that is getting distributed across a lot of devices that have multiple cards on the device, the number of cards could be as high as well over 50. I mean, it's really mind-boggling. And by the way, that number is even more significant given that this study was only conducted over a 3 or 4 month period. So in other words, this number can only get worse, right? It cannot get better. So if you are lengthening the period over which you're looking at, you're just going to see more and more cards on the device. You're either going to see the exact same number, or it's going to be more. It cannot go down, right, when you look at it over a long period of time. So this is very interesting. Again, it's a new source of information that can be, very effectively used. Let's go to the next one. So without making you wait for too long, I just want to show you what we were able to do by way of improvement in the model. Again, this particular model against which we are comparing the model that also includes the device ID information in real time is an extremely good model. I mean, best in class. We haven't seen anything that outperforms that. But including device ID information in real time is effectively outperforming this model by a very significant percent. So if you look on the x-axis, we have the outsort volume. Again, beyond a few percentage points of outsort volume. In no model is that interesting, right? I mean, all models are created equal if you're going to, treat all the transactions, right? So the real value of a model is in what percent of the frauds it can push to the very high-end scoring population. That's where you get the most, bang for the buck. So here you see that at a 1% outsort volume, there is pretty significant value. So we have 3 lines in here. The line you see in the middle, the red line, that is the average transaction detection rate gain. So across all these different portfolios, and we look at what kind of gains can be had in transaction detection rate, the average is about 10%. And if you look at the high end, it goes to about 13, 14%, and at the low end, it's about 7% or so. A pretty significant improvement, in terms of what it can do within 3D Secure, right? But we feel that the real value of this can actually be achieved outside of 3D Secure. So I'm pretty sure there are a lot of fraudsters who test card numbers on 3D Secure sites and then take them to either non-3D Secure sites where there can be significant value that can be had by avoiding, having to, get the refund back and so on. Even though the liability is not with the issuer, I know that, I mean, no issuer I've talked to really wants that fraud, right? The non-3D Secure e-commerce fraud, because it's just a hassle, going and actually retrieving the money, from the merchant, and they actually spend money, in order to get that. So if there is an effective way to combat that, there is significant value. The other interesting thing is there is a lot of card present, especially ATM fraud, that is preceded by e-commerce fraud. So if we can effectively figure out that, hey, on this particular device, we have had transactions from, 50 different cards, and we know for a fact that this is fraud, and if you have a score that can effectively identify that, that information can be forwarded on to the authorization side to take care of the first 2 or 3 transactions that typical authorization fraud detection solutions really struggle to stop, especially on card not present fraud. And the reason for this is, card not present, first of all, is a different beast. I mean, if you just go with the traditional fraud models on the authorization side, again, I've spent many, many, many years on this side of the equation, right? If you simply have the normal information like MCC and, transaction amounts and the time at which it happened and so on, it may have absolutely no relevance to the problem you're trying to solve because, you have no insight into where this transaction is happening even, right? I mean, it could be a $200 transaction that looks completely benign, looks completely okay, but that is actually fraud because, it is either happening from Timbuktu or, it's being preceded by, a whole bunch of transactions for the same amount on multiple issuers or perhaps both, right? So these pesky first few transactions on the authorization side that even very effective authorization fraud solutions cannot stop, can be effectively handled, if you understood the information on the other side and you figure out a way to forward that information, right? That is where we believe that there'll be significant value. Again, in terms of taking authorization data and looking at what this can do by way of stopping fraud, we are conducting that study. We don't have the results of that yet. But even within 3D Secure, we were surprised at how much additional value we could add, right? So again, these models are extremely effective. The model against which this was compared, right? Where it takes like the, 85% of the fraud in the top few percentage points of the scoring population. So extremely effective model, but this particular model, including the device ID, in real time, modeling it in real time, is able to provide value over and above that. So let's go to the next slide. So I just want you to look at how these different portfolios are, how are they in terms of, fraud rates and other things. So if you look at fraud rate, you see that it kind of covers the entire gamut, right? So you see some portfolios where the fraud rate is like, a couple of basis points, and then you also see some where it's over 70. There are some regions in the world where the fraud rate can be really, really high. And the other beauty of this is it opens up the possibility of issuers, say in Australia, collaborating with issuers in US to combat a fraudster who's sitting in Bulgaria with card numbers from both regions, right? So you really have the ability to do something like that. Again, I've been in the fraud arena for many, many, many years, for about 20 years now, and I've always, heard this kind of utopia where, issuers can collaborate in real time and be able to share information and so on. And if you're trying to share information using card number or social security number or anything like that, it's really not feasible because these sorts of things become extremely sensitive, number one. The second thing is some of these so-called identifiers may not even hold meaning when you go to a different part of the world, right? It has no meaning. Whereas if you have insight into the device, you are actually able to share information based on an entity through which the fraudster is actually performing fraud. So, I mean, that is the beauty of something like this, where, you have a real-time network where you can collaborate and combat, fraudsters. So let's go to the next one, some additional information on this data. Here, what we are looking at is, within non-fraud and within fraud, what percent is really on a domestic device. So, you take the devices and you classify it into whether it's domestic or foreign, and the blue bars represent non-fraud and the red bars represent, fraud, and we've done this within each issuer, right? So you see that, for example, take issuer number 3, you see that only 30% of fraud is actually on a domestic device. 70% is on a foreign device, right? Whereas you take a different issuer, issuer number 9, 80% is on a domestic device, only about 18% is on a foreign device. And again, there are pretty significant regional differences, with respect to this. In regions where it is easier to conduct fraud, it is done, in a domestic fashion. In regions where it is harder, they tend to be, foreign transactions. So, and on all of these issuers, this sort of model is very effective. So even though the underlying data really seems to be very different, there is some common thread here that can be exploited, using a model like this. So let's go to the next one. And here, I just wanted to show you how much the median transaction amounts can vary, right? So if you look in the US, typically the 3D secure e-commerce transaction amounts are pretty low. And the other interesting thing is, if you look at fraud, it is even lower. And the reason for that is most of the models we have are perhaps tuned to catching the higher dollar value transactions and so on. So when we move to chip and pin and, e-commerce fraud really hits us in the US, like it has, across different regions, this becomes pretty significant. If the barrier to entry, is very easy to get through, then you're going to get hit by a lot of transactions over small dollar amounts that can really cause, significant amount of trouble. So you see here that in terms of the, non-fraud amount, the median, again, if you look at the average, it varies quite a bit across the regions, but if you look at the median, it's about, 100, 150 or so across the globe. But if you look at fraud, in some regions or in some issuers, it's really high, and some it is low. You can look across these, and there are some regions that are represented by more than one issuer, but there are quite a few regions that are represented by just one issuer in this particular study. So where you see the fraud amount is very high, you see that it's a highly evolved, 3D secure market where it's very difficult to conduct fraud. And so when they're going to, perform fraud, they just go for a higher amount. And those sorts of shifting phenomena are going to happen in the US as well. And the good news is that we have all this experience from elsewhere. Why not use it, right? How can we make use of it effectively? I would say at the very minimum, you need to have, a model and also, perhaps do the real-time network as well. So let's go to the next one. And here, what I want to show is that fraud is more likely when transactions from multiple issuers are conducted on the same device. So here, what you can see the significant shift in the graph when you're looking at fraud versus non-fraud, right? And on the x-axis, you have the number of issuers. On the y-axis, you have the percent of devices. So if you look at fraud, you certainly see that it has a much higher propensity to be fraud if you have more than one issuer on the same device, as opposed to non-fraud. So non-fraud and fraud, there is a significant difference. If there were no difference, then the two lines will look very similar. And the reason why this appears chopped off, at 4 is that it is for, a short period of time. And again, the number of issuers represented here is, is not that many. And as I told you, there are only 9 or so. So let's look at the next slide. Again, it is looking at the same information in a slightly different manner. Here we are looking at the number of cards versus the percent of devices for fraud versus non-fraud. So what is the difference between number of cards and issuers? The difference is that the same issuers could have multiple portfolios and multiple cards, right? Whereas if you look at issuers, even if there are multiple cards, we club it into, it's under that issuer. So whether we look at it in terms of the cards or the issuers, you see that there is significant dichotomy between, fraud and non-fraud as the number of cards or issuers increases on a particular device. And that information can be effectively used in real time to produce some significant value for issuers. So let's go to the next one. Again, some additional data. So here we are looking at the number of transactions on the x-axis and the percent of devices. So if you look at devices with multiple fraud transactions, in some cases you find 40 transactions on the same device, right? And obviously they have all been allowed. That's why you're able to see the fraud. If they have been stopped, then it would have been censored data, right? We would not have been able to see it. And what I'm going to do in the next couple of slides is take you through a specific example we saw that was just unbelievable, right? And remember, this is only on a very short period of time, right? When we look at it over a year, this picture is only going to look worse. It's not going to look any better, right? So let's go to the next slide. So I want to take you through this particular example. Here, a fraudster used 54 different cards from 5 different banks to buy watches using each one of the cards from an online merchant called Sunwatch in Spain on the same device. So if we looked across device data, starting from the 3rd transaction on the device, we could potentially thwart the other 52. So I want to draw your attention to the last 2 columns. So the last but one column that says RA score, that is based on the high-end neural network-based score that we produce that's only looking at one bank worth of data, right? If you look at the next one, the RT score, that is assuming that we have a real-time network and we're able to see devices in real time across issuers, across cards. So when we do that, you see that, it is missing the first few transactions. So again, higher score means significantly higher probability of fraud, and lower score means low probability of fraud. And here we see RA score is 0.27 for the first one, and then, so if you look at the RT score, it's 0.18, then goes to 0.53, and by the way, 0.81 is a very high score. So starting from the 3rd transaction, it completely nails it. You see some scores here that are 0.99, 1. I mean, 1 is it's saying, hey, 100% probability of fraud. Stop it. So if we had this network in place, we could have gotten rid of, so many 84-pound, transactions that we have seen, again, across multiple issuers. So let's go to the next slide. You can see that this string continues. And it goes on for, 54 different cards. And you see that consistently the real-time network score is scoring it very high, whereas the RA score is not. And there is very good reason for it, right? If you look at the amount of the transaction, it's a very small one. And if on a particular card I see only one transaction, I see no reason to score that very high, right? If it goes to the authorization side, I bet this will be allowed through as well, because it's not a big dollar amount. And seeing one transaction on Sunwatch, anyone could do that, right? I mean, it's nothing out of the ordinary. So I would say authorization fraud solutions would score it way lower than what even the RA score has done. Because the RA score would say, for some this is uncharacteristic. For some of the cardholders, it's not characteristic for them to be connecting, from this particular location and buying something on a Spanish website, right? It will have that information. Authorization solutions won't even have that information. It will basically say that, yeah, everything looks normal. Whereas the moment you start modeling the device ID in real time, you can have huge impact on the fraud and pretty significant value, even though the dollar amount or the amount of the transaction is pretty low here. If you have 20 transactions for that amount, all of a sudden it adds up, right? It becomes a significant amount. So in conclusion, let's go to the next one. So if you look at the data that's available for e-commerce transactions, it's a lot more interesting than what is traditionally available in the authorization stream. Unfortunately, has not been fully utilized to combat fraud yet. It is now possible to share data across issuers without any huge workout, right? We have the ability to do that because we run it in the cloud, and we have the ability to see across issuers without compromising any of the individual issuers' data, because we're doing it using the device ID. Knowing a person's device ID really, doesn't really give you anything, as opposed to a card number or more sensitive information like, social security number. And the global experience, the 3D secure heritage, and the award-winning, model performance that we have seen can really help issuers thoroughly prepare for the e-commerce revolution. And I would say that the e-commerce onslaught that's about to hit, the U.S. And again, we have the experience of seeing it across the globe, and we're going to see it here. I think we can be much better prepared. So I just wanted to share that, and happy to take any questions.